Hi everyone, and welcome to this Devtoberfest session on Cloud Native Day. This session will be about how to build front-end applications in Cloud Foundry, and more specifically, this is going to be an end-to-end journey, meaning we will start on our local machines, build an app there, and then push it to Cloud Foundry and make it work in the cloud. And before we actually start, I want to quickly show you what kind of application we're going to build today. So this is basically it. It doesn't look like much, but it's a UI5 application that displays a list of names, and those names are not in a local JSON file or anything like that. They're actually coming from an ABAP system, like a real productive SAP ABAP system. And it requires authentication and destinations and all that good stuff. So we're going to do all of that today. What's the goal of this session? So the overall goal of this session is to understand the bigger picture. Right? How does Cloud Foundry work? How can I get code that runs on my local machine? How can I get that to run in Cloud Foundry? How are things connected? What are apps? What are services? Those kind of things. We actually want to understand how to connect apps and services, right? We have apps that require runtime, and we have services. We can create instances of services that Cloud Foundry provides, for example, the destination service, authorization service, or any other service for that matter. And how can we connect those two, and how are those two different also? And we want to understand how to control apps and services. How can we update apps? How can we create a new instance of a service? How can we delete things, right? Those sort of things. And for all of that, we're not going to use any templates or wizards or anything like that. We're going to do it all ourselves, and we're going to do it all from scratch. Meaning it's a little bit more manual work, but I feel like we're going to get a lot better understanding of how things actually work if we put in the work, right? Okay, so let's check out the architecture of the app that we're going to build today real quick. Okay, we're going to start with the SAP Approuter, all right? And by the way, this architecture might look pretty complicated, but it's actually just the structure of Cloud Foundry. So we have the business technology platform where we have a sub-account of the Cloud Foundry environment. In that sub-account, we have a space. And in that space, we have applications and service instances. And the SAP Approuter that we're going to build is one of those apps. That's going to be our starting point. Then we're going to connect this SAP Approuter with the SAP HTML5 application repository service, with the destination service, and also with the authorization and trust management service. The destination service, or the instance of that service that we're going to create and use and connect to the Approuter, will hold all the information that it needs to connect to the ABAP backend, right? And in order to be able to connect to that ABAP backend, the users obviously need to be authorized. So that's why we need the authorization and trust management service. And the HTML5 application repository service is there just to host our front-end application. But so far we haven't created any front-end application in this architecture here. We just have the Approuter that routes the user perhaps to a front-end application, but that hasn't been defined yet. So we are also going to build a front-end application and use the HTML5 app deployer, which is an NPM package, just like the Approuter, by the way. Use this package to deploy an HTML5, more specifically a UI5 application to Cloud Foundry, and also connect it to the HTML5 application repository service. So that way, if the Approuter points to it, it can actually consume, redirect to the HTML5 code. Right? Okay, let's start with the coding. Okay. So I'm in VS Code here, installed on my local machine, and we are going to start this project by creating an Approuter directory. And inside that Approuter directory, we are going to create a new package.json file, as our Approuter is a Node.js-based application. And I'm just going to copy some code over. So our Node.js application has a name, Devtoberfest Approuter. It has a start script that actually points to its only dependency, the SAP Approuter package. Okay, and every Approuter needs an xsapp.json file that describes its routing behavior. Okay, so that's our routing behavior described right here. We have a welcome file that for some reason points to devtoberfest ui5/index.html, and that's actually not yet defined, but that will be the ID of our UI5 app. And since both the app router as well as the UI5 application will be connected to the HTML5 apps repo, this call is going to work once we get there. The authentication method is set to route, which just means it's going to pick up whatever authentication types we have defined in the individual routes. And the first route is the user API service. That's a service that the app router provides internally, and it just allows us to fetch some information about the logged in user, such as the name and the email address, also the roles, scopes on BTP. But actually we're not going to use that endpoint, so I'm going to collapse it for now. And then most importantly, we have the ABAP endpoint. So whenever we call /ABAP and then something from our app router is going to do a request to the ABAP destination, which we are going to define soon, on our behalf. And actually I just noticed that the ABAP endpoint requires authentication. So we want our app router to use or to use the token, basically the OAuth token that we probably already have once we access the app router, and use that token to authenticate against the ABAP destination and consume that ABAP backend that way. Okay, so if we were to, let's first of all save the file. If we were to run this app router locally now, that actually wouldn't work because we haven't configured anything regarding the XSUA instance yet, or the destination also. That information is not there yet. So what we want to do is actually we want to deploy our app router to Cloud Foundry first and bind it to all of those services. So the XSUA instance, the destination instance, as well as the HTML5 apps repo. So that's all going to be set up in Cloud Foundry, and then we can grab the environment variables from that app router and put it in a default env.json here locally, and that way also run our app locally. Okay, so we want to deploy our app router, and the easiest way to deploy an application to Cloud Foundry is really using a manifest, manifest.yaml. And let me copy some code over. Okay, so we define one application with the devtoberfest app router as a name, and we select the Node.js build pack, right? As I said, our application is a Node.js application. We define memory and disk quota. So an application in Cloud Foundry requires runtime, and that's the configuration for that. Actually, I'll put a link to the SAP documentation in the description down below, where you can find a guide on how much quota and memory you'll probably need for the traffic you expect on your app router. That might be helpful. Then we set the random route attribute to true, because we want Cloud Foundry to generate a random URL for our app router, because URLs in Cloud Foundry are pretty much guessable. And probably I have the same app running somewhere else, with the same URL, with devtoberfest app router as the name, therefore the URL is the same. So I just set random route to true, because then Cloud Foundry will attach some random things to the URL or to the domain, and that way, things won't get mixed up. The path is the current directory, and the services, those are all the services we want to bind our application to. So we will have a XSUA instance, a destination instance, and an instance of the HTML5 apps repo. Okay, let's save that. So usually I would just go ahead and say cf push now, right? Run the command cf push, and that will push our app to Cloud Foundry. But that would fail now because we haven't actually defined the services or created the services yet. So let's do that now. Let's create a new directory called service instances. It could be any name, but that name just made sense. And inside that directory, we will create a new file, which is called accessSecurity.json. And I pasted some code in here. So the accessSecurity.json is the configuration for the accessUA instance. And the accessUA instance requires two things that are mandatory. So the first is the access app name, which I just set to devtoberfest-accessua, and the tenant mode. Tenant mode dedicated just means that it's not a multi-tenant application. And then additionally, we also set OAuth 2 configurations, and the redirect URIs are those two. That just means that in our authentication flow, when our app router says, hey, you got to authenticate, and redirects us to the accessUA instance, we want to be redirected back to the app router. And the accessUA instance is not going to allow that by default. So we specify those two URLs as the ones that are allowed, for redirecting. So let's save that. And now we can actually go ahead and create the first service instance, the accessUA service instance. Let me log into Cloud Foundry first. I'll probably fast forward, so I will say cf login, and I'll do the login thing. Okay, so I'm now logged in, and now we can say cf create service, and now we need the name of the service, which is accessUA, and the name of the service plan, which is application. And then we need the name of the instance that we want to create, devtoberfest-accessua, and that name has to match whatever we define here. Okay. And then we wanted to use the configuration, so -c of the, and we are in the Cloud Native directory, so we have to say in the service instances /accessSecurity.json. So we want to create a service of an instance of the service accessUA of the service plan application with this name, and it's going to pick up the configuration from the file that we just created. So let's try that. That was successful. Awesome. And actually, let me navigate into the service instance directory. That's a little easier. Okay, next we are going to create a new file. Again, a configuration file, but this time for the destination configuration. Okay, and this file is going to hold all the information that allows the destination instance to connect to the ABAP system, right? So we have some secrets in here as well. So I will blur some parts of the screen here. And that's all the configuration that we need. So we define an instance level destination, and that destination has a client ID, a client secret, authentication, and also a URL. And that's the actual URL of the ABAP system. And you might be wondering where I get this information from, like how do I connect to the ABAP system? Where do I get the client ID, secret, all of that? Where do I get that from? And you can get that from wherever so we are using an ABAP cloud system here, ABAP environment on BTP, and we can create a service key for that. So we have created a service key ABAP dest here, and if we click on the three little dots here and then say view, in case the browser session wouldn't expire or would still be active, we would see all of those things here. So we would see the client ID, secret, service token URL, all those things. We would see that here. Actually, it's good that we don't see here, so I don't have to blur it. But I think you get the point. So create a service key for the ABAP environment, and there you get all that information. Okay, so in a very similar manner as we created the XSUA instance, we will now create the destination instance. Okay, so we're going to say CF create service destination. The plan is light. The name is Devtoberfest destination, and we wanted to use the configuration in the dest.config.json. So very, very similar to what we did with the XSUA before. Let's run that. That is successful too. Perfect. And now what we need next is the service instance for the HTML5 apps repo. So if you go back to the manifest, you see we have one piece missing here, the Devtoberfest HTML5 runtime. So let's say, and we don't need any configuration for that, so no additional file required. We can just say cf create HTML5 apps repo. The service plan is app runtime, because the app router actually requires runtime because it's consuming things from the HTML5 apps repo. It's not just having static content sit there. That's going to come later with the UI5 app. But now for the app router, we need the app runtime service plan. The name of the instance is Devtoberfest HTML5 runtime. And hit enter. And that works as well. Perfect. Okay. Now I believe we can deploy our app router, because now it has all the services that it needs available in Cloud Foundry. And we can say cf push in the app router directory. Okay, so the deployment was successful, which is awesome. So I think we can grab this URL and check it out. So let's use this. And we're being asked to log in, which is good because we define that in the xsapp.json of the app router. And for this sub account, we have multiple identity providers, so that's why it's asking me, to select one. I'll just go with the default one. And it says not found, which actually isn't that bad, because of course it doesn't find anything because we haven't defined this Devtoberfest UI5 thing yet, right? But if we try and access the ABAP destination, remember in the xsapp.json, we had /ABAP as, the kind of key or identifier for the ABAP destination. So if we put our final endpoint and, where do we have that? So I know the final endpoint that we're trying to get to, so let me just put that here. So .com/abap/sap and then we want to eventually get to the passenger entity, and that works. Okay, cool. So we actually know that our app router works now. Let's also try and make that work locally, right? Let's try and consume that ABAP data through our app router, but locally. Okay, so maybe, let's do that. So we want to create, as I said before, we want to grab the environment variables from the app router running in the cloud and use those environment variables also locally. And we can put those in a default env.json file. Okay, and that file, first of all, what I'm going to do first is define a new port, because I know whenever I try and run the app router on a Mac, the default port, which is 5000, is always occupied by some internal thing. So I have to specify a new port. And now I can actually go into we can actually already see our Devtoberfest app router here in the BTP cockpit. So that's the app that we deployed. We can, by the way, also check out the service instances. Those are the 3 service instances that we created. But let's go back to the apps, app router, and here in the environment variables, we see this vcap services object, and we want to grab that, including the destination and HTML5 apps repo. Yeah, we can grab that too, but most importantly the XSUA2. So all of that, let's copy that and put it in here. And I believe there's one closing bracket too much. Yeah. Okay, so I will collapse those. Actually, the HTML5 apps repo we can delete for now. We're not going to use it in our scenario. Okay, so those are the environment variables, and I just collapse those now so I don't have to blur everything. But you will see when you try it yourself what all the information in there is. And that should be enough to run our app router locally. Okay. So first of all, of course, we have to install all the packages, or actually there's only one dependency, but we need to install that. So npm install in the app router directory. Okay, so the dependencies are installed, and now we can run npm start. Right, the app router is listening on port 5001. Let's try that. Localhost 5001. We're also getting a not found, which is fine, but we really want to try the ABAP endpoint. Passenger, that's the entity that we're going to use. And that works perfectly fine. All right, cool. Okay, so now our app router runs locally, but as you saw, we're still getting a not found on the actual index.html, so on our UI5 app. So let's build that UI5 app. Let's go back to VS Code. Let's collapse all of that. We can kill the app router for now. And actually, let's go into the project root. And we're going to create our UI5 app with a tool called Easy UI5. It's a pretty cool open source project. I'll put a link to it in the description. It allows you to scaffold UI5 applications very easily. So we're going to run Yo Easy UI5 project. Okay, so it's asking me what I want to do. I want to create a new app. I want to name it UI5. And the next question is the namespace. Yep. The namespace is Devtoberfest, and I know that those two in combination will become Devtoberfest.ui5 as the ID, and that's what's going to be later on when we deploy to the HTML5 apps repo. That's going to result in this as the sort of identifier of that application. That's why I picked this namespace and name. Okay. Next question, do we want to enable the Fury Elements flexible programming model? Not for now. We're going to use a static web server because we want to handle the app router and all of that ourselves. The XML view type is fine. OpenUI5 is fine as well. We would like to create a new directory, yes. JavaScript code assist libraries are cool as well. And we don't need a Git repo for now. Okay, now it's creating the project for me. You can already see the directory here, and it's also going to run an npm install for me, so it's going to take a second. Okay, so the application has been created, and let's check it out. So we have a root with a UI module and a web app, and that's where the actual UI5 app lives. And in our manifest, we can see that the ID is what we expected. It's devtoberfest.ui5, and that's going to result in devtoberfest ui5 without the dot, and that's how the app router and the HTML5 apps repo are going to kind of meet each other. And now we can start creating the UI5 app in terms of consuming the actual data from the ABAP backend. So let's define a data source here in the SAP Apps section. So a new data source, that's what I just pasted in here. A new data source, which is called ABAP source. That's just a name that I made up. And the URI is the endpoint that I know that we're trying to get to, but without the entity, without the dash passenger. But that's the service that we're going to consume. And this ABAP piece right here, that's what's going to trigger the app router to do the request on our behalf. We know the service is of type OData and it's version 2. Okay. Now, to be able to use that data source, we will have to create a model. So let me grab some code again. And if we scroll down a little into the model section of the UI5 app, we can create a new model, and I call it ABAP. It's going to use the data source, ABAP source, which I just defined a few seconds ago. And those settings here are just some OData specific things to make sure that the call actually works. So very UI5 specific as well. I'm going to save that. And now I believe our data source and model are all set up. So we can actually use this model in our view. So we have a main view in here. So the main view is going to be placed inside the app view. And we can replace the current content of that view, which is not a lot, as you can see, with a list. So we are displaying a list, and the items of that list are going to be whatever comes back from the ABAP data source, right? The ABAP model, and then / passenger. So that's the entity that we want to use, and that entity holds passenger information, right? So the items are going to be the passengers, and then in the rows of the list, so the list items are each going to be passengers, as I said, and it's going to be the first name and last name. So again, data binding syntax here, the ABAP model, and from that ABAP model, the first name. But since we're in the passenger entity, which is like an array, it's going to be the first name of each of the items, right? And that's going to be combined with the last name. Okay, let's save that and try that out. So now we have our UI5 app locally. We have our app router that is actually working locally. So we want to use those two together, right? But because the glue of those two, which will be the HTML5 apps repo, once we deploy both of those, that doesn't exist here locally, right? So we will need some other way of telling the app router that, hey, right next to you there is a UI5 application that we want to get to. For that, we will create a new route in the xsapp.json of the app router. So just after the ABAP route, we will say that, hey, for this scenario, right, we're running locally, because this is all running locally here. Whenever we say devtoberfest /UI5, which is what we do up here, right? Whenever we say devtoberfest just devtoberfest UI5, we want you to actually use a local directory. This is this one right here, right? So since this is just running locally, and I wouldn't deploy this piece to Cloud Foundry, because in Cloud Foundry, the glue between the app and the app router will be the HTML5 apps repo, but for this scenario running locally, we want the app router to pick up the local directory next to it. So let's try that out. Let's cd into the app router, and say npm start and refresh this. And we have a UEFI application and we also see some data. Awesome. So now we have an app router running locally that is connected to a destination in Cloud Foundry through the environment variables. That destination is connected to an ABAP environment, and then we're using a UEFI app running locally alongside that app router to consume that data. That's pretty cool. So I believe all that's left for us to do is deploy this UI5 application into the HTML5 apps repo in Cloud Foundry. So let's go back to VS Code, and we can stop the app router for now. And we want to use an npm package called HTML5 app deployer, I believe, and use this npm package. So it's a Node.js application that we're going to deploy, and the Node.js application will have the UI5 application sort of inside, like in its belly, and we're going to push all of that to Cloud Foundry using the HTML5 apps repo service. Okay, so we need a new Node.js application, so we're going to create a new directory. It's called HTML5 deployer. That name just made sense to me. And in there we're gonna create a new package.json. Oh, that's on the wrong level, but I'm gonna move it just a second. So a new package.json with the name Devtoberfest HTML5 deployer. It also has just one dependency, and that is the npm package HTML5 app deployer, and the start script pointing to that dependency. So let's save that and move that in here. Okay, so that's our Node.js application, and we want to push that to Cloud Foundry, and we do that by creating a new manifest.yaml, and that manifest.yaml looks pretty similar to the one from the app router. So it's just one application with a name and using the Node.js build pack. We use the same memory and disk quota configuration because we're not expecting a lot of traffic. But now, very different to the app router, this time we're going to set the no route attribute to true. So we're not going to use a random route like with the app router, but no route actually for the HTML5 deployer, because we don't want our users to be able to directly access the UI5 app. We want them to use the app router and access the front-end code that way, right? So the HTML5 code actually doesn't have a route, so you can't access it directly. The path is the current path because we are in the HTML5 deployer with this manifest. And the service that this app is going to be bound to is the Devtoberfest HTML5 host. And that service is also an instance of the HTML5 apps repo instance, but it's using a different service plan than the app router. The app router is using the app runtime because it's actively consuming the repo, and the HTML5 deployer is only going to use the app host because it only puts content there just once during deployment. Okay, and speaking of that instance, I believe it makes sense to create this new service instance now. So let's run this command right here. cf create service HTML5 apps repo. That's the service that we're going to use. This time the plan, as I said, is app host, and that's the name of the instance. So let's run that. Okay, that's good. And now as I said before, we want to deploy this HTML5 deployer, which is a Node.js based app, but it's going to have the UI5 app in its belly when we push it to Cloud Foundry. So let's actually do that now. We want the build result of our UI5 application to be inside that HTML5 deployer directory. So move this piece this Devtoberfest UF5 app in here. And we can do that by modifying the build script of the UF5 app. So whenever we run build UI module, it actually runs UF5 build, la da da, la da da, and then here we have defined a destination, sort of a output directory, right? And right now it's configured, you know, it's pointing to the UI module directory and creating a dist folder in there. But let's delete that. And let's say we want to go one level up into the HTML5 deployer. And in there, we need a new resources directory because that's what the NPM package expects. It expects all the apps to be in a resources directory. And in there, we need one directory for each of the apps. So we're just going to call this one dist. Okay, that looks good. So now the build would move the result into the HTML5 deployer. But one thing we also have to configure, because web apps that are hosted in the HTML5 apps repo not only need a manifest.json, you know, with the important ID here, but they also require a xsapp.json. Actually, just like the app router. So let's create this file, and I will copy some code over. So we define an index.html as the welcome file. The authentication method is route, just like with the app router. But now for this app, all the requests that actually hit this app, so that's all the requests here, because that matches everything. All the requests will stay sort of in the HTML5 apps repo and will point to that app, right? So that file is mandatory for the deployment to work. And I believe now we can go into the UF5 app directory. So cd devtoberfest UF5. Now we can trigger the build, and I believe the main build script is build UI. Yeah, build UI triggers a build UI module, and build UI module is what we changed here. So let's run that. Okay, yep, that was pretty fast. And now, yep, now we have a resources directory inside the HTML5 deployer. And it also contains a dist folder. Okay, perfect. Now I think we can go ahead. Let's go into the HTML5 deployer directory. And now we can, actually let's run an npm install before we deploy it, before we run cf push, because in this CF, in the Cloud Foundry documentation, it actually recommends to vendor the dependencies. So we should run an npm install locally and push the dependencies to Cloud Foundry as well. And we didn't do that with the app router, but we actually really should do that. So npm install, and now we can say cf push, and that will include the node modules that we now have here after the install. Okay, so the deployment just finished. Let's check out our app router. Probably need to refresh this page. Here we can see our new app, the HTML5 deployer, but we want to access the app router. And we can see the UF5 app, and we can also see the data. Awesome. So now we are actually done. So if we go back to our architecture real quick, so we have started with the app router, right? And we deployed it to Cloud Foundry, created those 3 service instances, and then took the environment variables to also run the app router locally. After that, we created the HTML5 module, we built the UF5 app, and then moved the build results in there, and then deployed that to Cloud Foundry as well. also consuming the HTML5 apps repo service, just with a different service plan. So we've done all that and we're done, which is pretty cool. So I want to emphasize that that's probably not the easiest way to build a front-end application on Cloud Foundry, but it's definitely a way that teaches us how the individual pieces work and gives us maximum control. So that's why I chose that path. But feel free to use any wizard or templates that you can find. And in case you have any questions regarding this session, here are my contact details. And also feel free to use the comment section down below to ask any questions. I will try and answer all of them. All right, thanks for tuning in and see you next time. Bye.